They called him Victor Crane because cranes built cities and he built profit. To the glossy real estate magazines that mattered, he was a deal maker. Sharp suits, sharper grin, hands that shook with the light touch of a man who'd never had to fight for a roof. To the tenants in the rows of shuttered storefronts and sagging brick he owned, he was the slumlord, cold, efficient, and ever inventive when it came to squeezing the last cent from people who had none to spare. On Alder Street, past the neon sweep of the bus depot and the bakery that still remembered butter, his building leaned like an old man against the wind. Paint had peeled away in long confessions. The elevator moaned poetry no sane mechanic wanted to fix. The wiring was a secret language. A window cracked months ago and never knew the winter had come. Victor collected rent like a priest collecting tithes, indifferent to the sermons of leaking pipes or the rattling, cold nights. Maya Alvarez had grown up 2 blocks over in a family that knew the economy of scarcity. Her mother worked nights, her father picked up day jobs whenever they could. When a roof finally came into their lives, it was never pretty, but it was theirs for a while. Later, when Victor Crane bought the block and the landlord before him gave up, Maya found she could not look the building in the eye and pretend it wasn't on her ledger. She had watched children walk through puddles in the hallway, watched fog of cigarette smoke settle on ceilings like an unwanted pantheon, watched old Mr. Powell try in vain to patch the heater with hope and tape. Maya could have moved. Lots of people moved. But Alder Street had become a ledger of people she loved, neighbors who knew the shape of her laugh, the rhythm of her steps. She took photographs sometimes, a blue sock on the clothesline framed by tenement bricks, Ms. Singh's roses peeking defiantly through a cracked stoop. She was a teacher by day, but her nights had become inert with a private, steady anger. That anger was a cold, practical thing. It organized itself like a school of fish, methodical and growing. First came Data. She and a few other tenants, Rosa with a laugh like a bell, Jamal who could fix anything you pointed at and would not take a cent, and Layla who kept everyone on calendar, compiled a list. Dates of rents paid, emails ignored, invoices for repairs that never happened. They dug through property records at the public office on Saturday mornings. They found permits Victor had never filed for the renovations that had been used to evict families on the upper floors. They found a paper trail that smelled faintly of the same thing. Quick flips, minimal investment, maximal cash flow extraction. Victor's blueprint was simple and cruel. Let the building run down until the tenants were desperate, then either jack up the rent or renovate and jack them out. He had a team, lawyers with patient smiles, contractors who left more dust than progress. He kept the heat low where he could, the lights dim, the code inspections at arm's length. When tenants complained, he sent soothing letters stamped with the city skyline and laced with the language of inevitability. The night the kernel of revenge set in motion, a storm came that felt like the city had been opened and poured into. The rain hammered Alder Street as if correcting some long imbalance. The building groaned. The old pipes, already brittle, broke in the basement. Water filled cavities and then rooms. The elevator refused to return. In 3 days the smell of damp became a third voice in the hallway. Victor called from his office, harsh light, soft leather chair, and offered, through his assistant, $200 as an emergency stipend. Small inconvenience, his assistant said, automatic as a vending machine. We'll reimburse. The tenants laughed without humor. Rosa's 2 children had to sleep at her sister's. Mr. Powell's oxygen machine hiccuped. No reimbursement arrived. That week Maya did the thing she had kept telling herself she would. She turned her anger into an instrument. She organized a meeting. 50 people packed into Ms. Singh's kitchen until you could not hear yourself think. She proposed a plan that smelled of careful, legal persistence. Document everything, file complaints, go to press, and, most importantly, collective storytelling. They would show the city and the city's people what Victor Crane's ledger of neglect actually looked like. Jamal wired the building for cameras in the common areas. The tenants were wary, but they had stakes. Privacy meant little when your child had nowhere to sleep. They bought cheap motion-sensitive cameras, trained them on the mailroom and the stairwell landing where Victor's maintenance crew, when they came, moved like ghosts, leaving more sacks than tools. Maya photographed the damage in high resolution, catalogued the dates, the texts, the voicemail complaints that had been unanswered. There are forms for abuse. There are boxes on municipal websites that accept protest. There are inspectors who will, when pushed, appear like reluctant saints. But there are also walls made of money and men with lawyers who can drown noise in procedure. The crucial thing Maya understood was that the story must be bigger than a building. She took that story to a local reporter, Samir Patel, who had grown up sympathetic to the underdogs in the city and had a column that smelled faintly of smoldering popcorn and justice. Samir listened to the documentation, the invoices, the photographs, the list of tenants who had been moved or threatened. He leaned forward and said, "You understand this is a David and Goliath thing." Maya shrugged. "I don't want David to be a martyr." Samir smiled, a small, grateful thing. He wrote in the way the city newspapers do when they remember they are guardians and not just printers of ads. He did not sensationalize. He showed up with a photographer who leaned an expensive camera against the mailbox and captured Mr. Powell's oxygen machine in the backdrop with the puddles. He quoted the building inspector, the one who, in his spare time, still remembered the enterprise of the law as something ongoing and public. He quoted the permits and the missing filings. He quoted the city's affordable housing official, who promised to look into the matter. The article launched like a small firecracker in the gutters of the city. On social media it spread, shared by people who remembered being tenants, who had once paid a slumlord's ransom in hope of a water heater. A local council member called it into a hearing. A documentary filmmaker called Samir to ask if the story could be expanded into a short about predatory landlords. Victor Crane did what predators do when light gets found on them. He smiled in public while moving his chess pieces. His lawyers drafted letters. He offered to work with the community. He invited a camera crew for a glossy, staged renovation announcement. He painted a single stairwell to gloss over the rest. He called Maya, once, carefully, inviting her to a meeting about community engagement. Maya accepted. She went in with Jamal and Rosa and a folder full of evidence. Victor's office smelled of coffee and new money. He was 15 years older than his photographs, but he still had that confidence set to his jaw. He promised, softly, to do right. He dangled levers, temporary relocation assistance, expedited repairs. Then he offered them a contract with fine print so thin you could miss it by blinking. Instead of signing, Maya recorded the conversation. They had told him the story in public now. They had rights as a community, and thanks to Samir's writing they had the attention of the city and the law. He could play the stooge now, but his next move would have to be public, too. The first blow to Victor's ledger was small and precise. A housing inspector, motivated and now shoulders shrugged less by politics, came to the building with an enforcement team. They found electrical hazards. They found rotten supports. They ordered immediate remediation and then, in a phrase that fell from their lips like verdict, an injunction preventing any eviction notices during repairs. Contractors Victor had lined up were halted. For the first time in years, his revenue stream clotted. Victor responded with a campaign of inconvenience. He cut back on cleaning, broke agreements, and sent notices that were designed to scare. He relied on scarcity. If you breathe fear into the occupancy of a building, the tenants leave before the ink dries. Maya anticipated these moves. They set up a legal fund, small commitments from each family pooled and matched by a crowdfunding campaign Samir linked to his article. People from other neighborhoods sent money because the story touched a thread they had known elsewhere. Real karma, Maya thought, doesn't look like vengeance. It looks like accountability. Still, she could feel the electric thrill when Victor's first attempt to use legal sleight of hand failed publicly. His lawyers, who had once smiled and gotten what they wanted, were nervous. The council member started to ask questions at hearings. The inspector documented everything meticulously. Each tick of the official pen was a small kind of weathering. Victor could no longer ignore the fact that the city was watching. He tried a different tack. Victor engaged in what wealthy men sometimes mistake for cunning, a public relations campaign. He donated to a neighborhood arts festival, $50,000 in sponsorship that guaranteed a ribbon-cutting photo op investing back into the community, his press release said. But it did not say his building had been condemned for hazards. It did not say he had been delaying repairs for months while he marketed upscale conversions to outsiders. The PR campaign tried to overwrite public record with glitter. The volunteers from Alder Street applied a better solvent, truth. They turned up at the festival with signs, small, handmade, precise as notes, and with the story in their pockets. They called reporters. They spoke in public meetings. They made sure the local paper ran a follow-up piece that stood like a mirror to Victor's sponsorship. The politicians who allowed their arms to be in ribbon-cutting photographs also remembered how their voters had read that earlier Samir article. Pictures of them with Victor were suddenly awkward. Victor began to lose the comfortable arrogance that had been his armor. He lost deals as investors grew skittish. Properties he'd eyed for transfer started to look shaky if paired with his name. A bank, sensitive to reputation and hearings, refused to underwrite a planned conversion after a quiet risk assessment. The city's housing board placed Victor's properties under a higher scrutiny, but the ledger still showed numbers. Money, even chastened, is sticky. Victor had options, some legal, some less savory. One night, after a hearing where the council member had publicly called for criminal neglect investigations, a smoky engine backed into Alder Street. Men with masks and fast shoes moved with the brutality of men who thought themselves immune. They pasted eviction notices on doors, fake, forged, post-dated. People woke to find notices as if a storm of law had deposited them. That was the night Jamal's hands felt heavy. He had fixed boilers that wouldn't be fixed. He had mended toys. He had fought with rats. He stood on the landing in the dark, hearing muffled footsteps. He thought of his father's hands, calloused, honest, and he understood the danger. They could not fight with fists. Their fight would be organized and visible. They took the forged evictions to the police, and the police, now that the story had traction, were obliged to act. An officer with kind eyes drove down with them, took the notices, ran their fingerprints. An investigation unfolded that traced the evictions back not to a headstrong crew of thugs, but to a man with offshore accounts and a penchant for plausible deniability. The subcontractor who had printed the fake paperwork, once loyal to Victor, spoke to a prosecutor after hearing his own name in Samir's second piece about the crisis. He had a conscience, or perhaps fear. Either way, he gave them the paper trail. It led to a shell company with Victor's signature on a payment. The city opened a formal inquiry into fraud. Victor called emergency meetings. He fired a manager. He fumed at reporters. In the courthouse, his name crossed paths with words that had not been there before: perjury, fraud, obstruction. His lawyers counseled containment and apology scripts. But containment requires a lid, and in a city with too many journalists and too many living rooms, lids get discovered. They held a public hearing. Maya watched Victor stand behind a podium and speak in the voice of contrition, polished and empty. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience. He promised to repair the building and to create a fund. His words sounded like a man reading a script written by someone else's conscience. He tried to put his palms together and looked smaller because the room had light, and light is heavy. Then the tenants were given voice. One by one, they told their stories. Mr. Powell, with his oxygen machine. Rosa, who had to move her children across the city for 3 weeks because of mold. Ms. Singh, who had planted roses for 40 years and watched them wither under neglect. Jamal spoke not as a mechanic but as someone who had watched the fabric of a community be converted into margins. When Maya stood up, she did not unleash a cathedral of vengeance. She spoke straight and steady. She told them the story of the photographs, the invoices, the summers they had slept with heaters on full because the pipes refused to cooperate. She looked Victor Crane in the eye and said, "We were not a ledger to be balanced. We were a neighborhood." The gallery filled with a low sound, like wind through thin glass. A lawyer for the city presented the findings: code violations, forged documents, and evidence that Victor had willfully placed tenants at risk to accelerate vacancies. The legal consequences mounted. Fines were assessed. For the first time since he had decided he could buy his way through anything, Victor could not buy a silence big enough. Karma, if one believed in karma as an old ledger of cosmic proportions, is not always immediate. It can be a patient thing, like ivy, slowly reclaiming a facade. For Victor, the reclamation took forms he had not expected. Investors pulled back. Council members who had once posed for pictures with him suddenly found the optics problematic. Partnerships evaporated. Contractors he had used for years began to cite misaligned values when they refused to bid on his projects. Banks reassessed risk. Even his PR firm suggested a different path, one with fewer headlines. But the most piercing change was not in his finances. It was in his reputation. The man used to smooth introductions and sticky appointments found doors closed and passwords revoked. He became, in polite society, a case study, a cautionary tale about the perils of treating homes like commodities. Victor tried to make amends in the language he knew best: checks and contracts. He established a fund for repairs and hired a credible property manager whose name carried weight. He attended hearings and signed agreements. He put in new boilers and repaired the elevator and paid fines that burned like the smell of caramelized sugar, sweet then gone. He showed up for ribbon-cutting photos and expressed deep regret. But Maya saw the difference between a ledger balanced and a community healed. The latter required labor and trust is not purchased with signatures. Months later, the building on Alder Street was a different kind of animal. The stairwell no longer sloshed with puddles. The mailroom smelled like paper and people again. The tenants had not been erased. New faces arrived, slowing the churn that had once defined the block. Mr. Powell's oxygen machine hummed like a lullaby. Rosa's kids ran in the courtyard. Ms. Singh's roses bloomed, cautious but brave. Victor Crane, in the end, took his place in the city's oral histories, an example both of hubris and of what can happen when a community organizes. He paid fines that hurt him, and he paid contractors more than he liked. He lodged appeals and fought in courtrooms with the obstinacy of a man who had always soiled his hands with other people's incomes. He tried to recover his brand by branding philanthropic initiatives. Some nights, Maya imagined him walking past the building without looking up, as if avoiding the faces that had cost him more than money. She imagined him at his breakfast table, alone, counting what remained. But the story was not about Victor alone. It was about the quiet collective heroism that had grown in the spaces between complaints. The tenant who refused to be shuffled out, the teacher who turned paperwork into action, the reporter who made the ledger public. It was about the smallest acts, photographs, shared dinners, pooled funds, that grew into a momentum hard to stop. It was about how justice, in municipal courtrooms and in city council chambers, could catch up to a man who had thought himself cleverer than law and kinder than conscience. Years later, Alder Street would still hold the memory of what had happened. The article Samir had written became a template, a case study taught in housing clinics. People would point to the building and say, "We did that." In the evenings, children ran past its stoop, and if you stood very still you could hear, barely, the echo of a lesson, that power concentrated is dangerous, but power shared becomes a community. Victor moved on eventually, as men in his position always must. Smaller deals, quieter corners. He had lost more than money. He had lost a certain center of gravity that had kept him buoyant through many seasons. He would learn, perhaps, that no contract could buy back trust. Maya, who once kept a ledger of images, threw a party on a spring evening for the tenants and the neighbors and Samir and the inspector who had believed them. They drank cheap wine and ate empanadas and laughed until long after the lights had been turned down. As they cleaned up, Rosa folded a napkin and handed it to Maya. "We got our street back," she said. Maya looked at the building as it stood, solid but not unscarred. "We didn't get anything," she replied. "We just stopped giving our homes away." Outside, the city moved on. Crane still rose, Suits still walked fast. But on Alder Street the ledger had been rewritten. Victor Crane's name still existed in the newspapers and in the thin file cabinets of the municipal office, but it no longer had the power to determine whether a child slept warm. That, in the end, was the truest form of karma, not some flashing cosmic retribution, but the steady, civic recalibration that occurs when people refuse to be invisible. And somewhere, months after the hearings, Victor stood in front of a mirror and practiced a smile that no longer fit. He adjusted his tie, counted his chips, and felt, for the first time in a long while, the real cost of his investments. Faces he had never met but had affected, and could not buy back. Thanks watching Yidio.